Okay, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this last presentation of this seminar on positioning ourselves for our future in science and Krishna consciousness, the 9 sets of questions we must ask. So, science had a very important place in Srila Prabhupada's vision for spreading Krishna consciousness in the modern world. In one of his purports to Srimad Bhagavatam, the verse about glorifying Krishna with choice words, Srila Prabhupada said, "Scientific knowledge engaged in the service of the Supreme Lord is factually Hari Kirtan." So this special kind of kirtan related to science and Krishna consciousness is an important part of our movement. And we all have to confront these questions, whether we're professionally engaged in one of the sciences as a professor at a university or a researcher at some scientific institute, or whether we're a devotee or temple manager or GBC member involved in preaching Krishna consciousness. Inevitably, questions come up about how we position ourselves as practitioners of bhakti yoga, as members of the Krishna consciousness movement, in relationship to science, scientists, and scientific questions. And if we position ourselves properly, individually and collectively, as a movement, our future is very bright. But if we position ourselves incorrectly, then the future is not so bright for us individually or collectively. So I'm going to present to you sets of questions that one is inevitably going to have to encounter, have to answer for oneself or on behalf of the organization for which one speaks. So the first set of questions, and I want to say, first of all, I'm not presupposing what the correct answers are to these questions. They may be answered correctly in a number of different ways. I'm just saying, whatever position one takes, one is going to confront these questions. And the first set of questions, how does one position oneself in terms of one's identity as a practitioner of bhakti yoga, and also as perhaps a member of the scientific community or as a devotee interested in scientific issues? There are a variety of ways in which one could position oneself. I was with a devotee this afternoon who's a professional scientist working in a scientific discipline in a university. He has 30 people working for him, and he doesn't really try in any open and obvious way to introduce Krishna consciousness into his actual scientific work, but he lets all of his colleagues know he's a member of the Krishna consciousness movement, and he finds they're perfectly comfortable with it, and they ask him questions. And so that's one way to position oneself. Another way to position oneself in the world of science or academics is to position oneself, yes, openly as, yes, I'm a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga, I'm a member of the Krishna consciousness movement, and I'm very interested in scientific research and ideas and evidence that are consistent with the Vedic literature, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and others. And that does not even exhaust the variety of positions that one may take personally in terms of one's real identity. How does one identify in one's heart? Jivaras Rupahoy Krishnarana Yadas. Ultimately, we're all servants of Krishna. But then how does one position oneself in terms of one's position in secular society or Varnashram society in relationship to that? So a second set of positioning questions arises when we consider how do we position ourselves in relation to the traditional Vedic epistemology. You know, we know from just our basic everyday Bhagavatam classes that according to the Vedic philosophy, there are three main kinds of pramanas or evidence. There's pratyaksha, sense evidence. There's anumana, logical inference. They're considered to be imperfect sources of knowledge because the senses are limited and imperfect, and the mind that we use for logic is limited and imperfect. We make mistakes, we become illusioned, we cheat or become the victim of cheating. So, according to the Vedic epistemology, there is another kind of evidence, another pramana, the Shabda pramana, transcendental sound emanating from the supreme, conscious, individual, personal source of everything that exists, who has perfect knowledge beyond all the imperfections of the material mind and senses. So then the question becomes, well, how do I, as a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga, interested in questions that have to do with modern science, how do I position myself in relationship to that epistemology? And I would say, well, the default position is to privilege the Shabda Pramana, the evidence that comes from Shastra, with whatever Shastra chooses to speak about. But others may take a position, well, perhaps we should take the position that the Shabda Pramana is only valid in connection with things beyond the range of the senses. Goloka Vrindavan, Krishna's Nitya Leela, things like that. And as far as anything within the domain of this material level of reality is concerned, then we privilege pratyaksha and anumana and govern our understanding of Shastra according to that. So I'm not saying what position is right or wrong, but just that inevitably one who confronts these questions will have to position themselves, take some position in relation to the traditional Vedic epistemology. And even there, when you agree, okay, the Shabda Pramana, that's the superior source, well then how do you understand a statement from the Shabda Pramana? You know, what about, so inevitably one's going to confront these questions. A third set of questions, it's related, but how does one position oneself publicly in relation to our core texts like the Srimad Bhagavatam and others? One position, say a professional academic or scientist might take is, well, let me do my scientific research without any direct mention of the Vedic literature or Bhakti Yoga, and let me just do research that results in findings that are consistent with what the Vedic literature tells us about the origin of life, the origin of the universe, or some other topic. And then let someone else who's engaged in preaching use those research results to openly defend, the conclusions of the Shastras. That's an attitude one might take. Or one might position oneself in the way of publicly identifying oneself as a supporter of the Bhagavatam worldview and actively pursuing research in the scientific field that's consistent with the findings, the conclusions of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So that's another set of questions that arises. There's a fourth set of questions that arise, and that is, how does one position oneself in relation to the statements that Srila Prabhupada made about science, scientists, and scientific questions in his books, letters, conversations, classes? As many of us know, some of those statements were very challenging and negative in a way. We kick on your face with boot. This Darwin was a rascal. His theory is ruining the entire human civilization, and so on and so forth. But when positioning ourselves in relation to the statements Srila Prabhupada made in connection with science, we should take into account, I propose, the full range of statements that he made and his practical behavior and his direct instructions to devotee scientists in his movement. So if one does that, I think one gets a more nuanced picture of things. For example, Srila Prabhupada dedicated his first book, Easy Journey to Other Planets, to the world's scientists. So that's now a fifth set of positioning questions comes up. How does one position oneself in relation to the previous acharyas who may have made comments on things related to science and bhakti yoga or Krishna consciousness? The default position there is to defer to Srila Prabhupada's opinions if there happens to be any difference between that of a previous acharya and Srila Prabhupada. But no matter what position one takes, one may like the approach taken by Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his introduction to to his book, the Krishna Samhita, where apparently, he took a position on the history of Vedic culture and the history of the Srimad Bhagavatam that's very much like that taken by modern Indologists. Of course, in the same work, he declares, although I sometimes talk like that to certain audiences, I myself accept the traditional views. You know, the Srimad Bhagavatam was composed by Vyasadeva at the beginning of the Kali Yuga and so on. But my point is that inevitably, if someone becomes involved in science and Krishna consciousness, they will have to answer those questions. A sixth set of positioning question comes up in this sense. How does one position oneself in relationship to other members of Iskcon who have previously made contributions in the area of science and Krishna consciousness? We have the work of Sadaputta Prabhu, Dr. Richard Thompson. We have the work of Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj, Dr. Tudam Damodar Singh. We have the work of, for example, Drutakarma Das and his book Forbidden Archaeology. And there are others, so many others who have previously made contributions in this area. So, but what about the new generations of devotee scholars and academics who are entering into the Krishna consciousness movement and beginning to think about these things for themselves? Can there be respectful disagreement with contributions made by previous generations of devotee scholars? Can there be kind of a respectable, deferential pointing out of mistakes? Can there be such things? Inevitably, if one becomes involved in this issue of science and Krishna consciousness, one is going to confront those questions. And from the standpoint of the older generation of scholars and academics and scientists, how do we position ourselves in relationship to those who are entering the field and beginning to explore these questions from their own point of view? You know, how can there be a fair evaluation of new contributions so that they're not rejected just because they were different than some previous contributors' take on things? Can there be a way in which new generations can selectively build on the foundations that are there, and while remaining true to the basic principles outlined by Srila Prabhupada and the Srimad Bhagavatam and others? So that's another set of questions that inevitably arises. A seventh set of questions comes up in the issue of how does one position oneself in relation with the existing science groups and organizations within Iskcon. In the 1970s, it was a relatively simple matter. Society was, although it was worldwide in scope, it was still a rather small society compared to the society that today exists in Iskcon, with its widespread presence, substantial presence in many areas of the world. So, question. In the 1970s, there was one Iskcon, one unquestioned authority, Srila Prabhupada, and he established one Bhaktivedanta Institute that was accepted by the whole society as the single voice of Iskcon in these matters. Fast forward 40 or 50 years, And we see we have a much larger society, a much more diverse society in terms of its leadership. We also find a proliferation of groups involved in the whole issue of science and Krishna consciousness. There are several different branches of the Bhaktivedanta Institute going on under different management with different policies and different focus. It's a Calcutta group, a Mumbai group, a Gainesville group, and it doesn't end there. There are so many academic and scientific organizations and groups of devotees springing up all over Iskcon. It's really not even possible for one person to completely understand all of the different manifestations that there are. So it becomes a question of positioning again. What position does one take in that regard? Okay, one might be a member of one of these groups. Then how does our group relate to the other groups who are involved in similar work in Iskcon? It becomes a question how to position oneself. Then another, perhaps a related set of questions arises. How does one, as a member of the Krishna consciousness movement interested in science, position oneself in relationship to Iskcon as a whole? In other words, taking a more global view, do we as leaders, I'm speaking here at the Iskcon Leadership Sanga, you are the leaders of the society. So individually and collectively, we're going to have to confront these questions. If we look at the diversity of academic and scientific groups that have existed and are continuing to be formed today in Iskcon, how do we position ourselves as a society? Do we look for more unity, more cooperation, more diversity? If one's a member of one of these groups, then how do you position yourself in relationship to the other groups? These are questions that inevitably arise. And finally, there's a set of very individual and personal questions that arise, and that is, as a member of Iskcon, dealing with science and Krishna consciousness, what do I individually want to accomplish? What aspect of the Vedic worldview would I like to see introduced into the world of science? Who will be my audience? How do I plan to reach that audience? And then one has to decide, how am I going to answer these questions? How am I going to make decisions about it? Am I going to just independently make all of those decisions myself? Am I going to make them in consultation with a few select friends? Am I going to make them in connection with the leadership of the group, the academic or scientific group to which I belong? Or, heaven forbid, take direction from somebody? These are all kinds of questions that inevitably arise for anyone who becomes involved in this area of science and Krishna consciousness. And as our movement becomes bigger and bigger, and we find that more and more of the people joining our society are coming already trained in different scientific disciplines, and they may be working in universities and scientific institutions. As more and more of our children grow up and enter the education system, and some of them go in on the STEM track, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We're going to confront these issues inevitably. So you may ask, okay, you've presented the questions. Now what about the answers? Well, that's up to you. What the answers are. Individually and collectively as a society, that's up to you. I can give answers to all of these questions. But yeah, that's not the main point, because I do that saying I recognize that others may answer those questions for themselves in a different way. But my point is that whatever one does, one is going to inevitably confront these questions. And if we find for ourselves, individually and collectively, the right answers to the right questions, then our future in Krishna consciousness and science is very bright. If we're lost and confused and don't have proper answers to these questions, then our future is a little less hopeful. So my question to you is, are these the right questions we need to be asking? Thank you. Hare Krishna. So, does anybody have any question or comment at this time? I will pass the microphone to you. Yes?
Puji, is there a place where we can find your answers to these questions? Like an article or something, website?
No, but I'll tell you briefly what my answers to the questions are. In terms of positioning and my dealings with the scientific world, which is principally the world of archaeology and anthropology. I have presented over the past few years dozens of papers at mainstream international scientific conferences on archaeology and anthropology. So I position myself as a representative of the Gaudiya Vaishnava worldview. And I take the position I'm in dialogue with scientists who are interested in this question of human origins and antiquity. And I try in my presentations, which are accepted, for presentation at these conferences and sometimes published in the scientific literature, that I'm exploring the relationship between the Vedic worldview and the modern scientific worldview on these questions. So briefly, that's how I position myself. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to position oneself. For everyone, they'll have to figure it out in their own way. And we could also speak about positioning ourselves collectively as a movement or as a group we may happen to belong to within the movement. But those are other questions. For me, it's just a personal matter right now. How does one position oneself in relation to the Vedic epistemology? I kind of take the default position. I privilege the statements of Shastra in whatever area it speaks, whether it has to do with the totally transcendental realm or the material realm. I take the default Mukhya Vritti reading of Shastra, which means take the direct dictionary meaning of the words, the simple direct understanding rather than some metaphoric or allegorical standing. That's my basic position. How do I position myself in relation to those who have made previous contributions? I acknowledge my debt to them, but I also trying to position myself in relation to the newer generation of scholars that I'm open to see. I have faith in them that they will find their own answers to these questions. They may approach things in a different way than I have, but I'll try to respect that and not just automatically reject it because it happens to be different from the way that I did it. I'm also open to be, corrected for any mistakes I've made or things like that. So, how do I position myself into the statements of Srila Prabhupada? I take his words as my life and soul. So, I try to understand not just an isolated statement he may have made, but take it in the context of all the statements he made on a certain topic. In relation to the previous acharyas, I privilege the position of Srila Prabhupada if there's some apparent difference between his thoughts and those of a previous acharya. How do I position myself in relation to the existing groups of academics and scientists? I try to stay in touch with all of them, as many as I can, and have good, friendly, working relationships with them, because I think they all have something to contribute. And finally, how does one position oneself in relation to Iskcon as a whole? Well, I would say my participation in this Iskcon leadership Sanga shows that I'm interested in what the society collectively does in positioning itself in this whole issue of science and Krishna consciousness. That's one reason I'm here, to confront the leadership with these questions that we ourselves as a movement, individually and collectively, will have to make decisions about ultimately. And my personal goals, I have the personal mission I've been given, and I'm trying to carry that out. And at different times in my career and devotional service, I've decided things independently. I've decided things in consultation with others, just friends, selected friends. I've done things in consultation with the groups to which I belong, take their guidance and direction. And sometimes I've even followed an individual authority who's asked me to do something. So I've done all of them. Those are my answers to the questions. Now, what are yours? That's the question. Something else.
Sometimes when I do media interviews, I had an experience a couple of years ago with a BBC editor that was supposedly doing a friendly story, but it wasn't. And he'd done some research, you don't believe we went to the moon, you think the moon's further away. And he was asking me, do you believe that? And it went on for a while, and then I asked him, I said, personally, it's not really important to me. There's so many things I study in the scripture. Some I can verify, some I can't. It's not so important to me. So I'm not really sure where it is. My tradition says that doesn't really matter to me. I said, what about you? He said, I'm convinced. I said, have you been there? He said, what do you mean? I said, have you been there? Have you been to the moon? Have you been to the sun? He said, no, of course not. I said, but then you're the one who's putting blind faith in something you can't prove. I'm the one who's being more reasonable. So do you find that kind of response is effective, or is that just my closed-minded Hare Krishna worldview?
Well, I don't think that there's one way to answer a question like that works for everybody in the Krishna consciousness movement. It worked for you in the situation that you found yourself in, but I wouldn't prejudge and say that another devotee in a different time, place, and circumstance might answer the question in another way that is, I would say, equally effective. Of course, if you really drill down deeply into the nature of the question, you'll run into these positioning questions that I've raised. How do we position ourselves in relation to the Vedic epistemology and the statements of our core scriptures, or the statements of Srila Prabhupada? One can position oneself in different ways. You outline one position. Well, in my personal practice of Krishna consciousness, these aren't hugely important issues for me personally. For someone else who's been asked that question, perhaps a devotee who studied planetary astronomy and is being approached as an authority on planetary astronomy, and particularly the motions of the lunar celestial body, they may have answered it in a different way. If they were asked the same question, maybe not by a media person, but another scientist in a scientific conference, drilling directly down on that point. Anything else?
Prabhu, I was wondering, why is this question of positioning coming up? Is it because we want to be better equipped to face the world through positioning, or is it that we want to market ourselves better through positioning?
The term positioning may come from the world of marketing and advertising, but it's not an artificial thing, that's just imposed. It is, you could say the term is being used by me as a metaphor for something we actually have to do, is to have, when the statements of Srila Prabhupada are brought to our consciousness and attention, we adopt a certain attitude towards them, which may be positive or negative. One may think, well, yeah, I don't like that, but I'm not going to say anything about it because of social pressure in the society, or that, yeah, I totally agree with that. It's a revelation to me. I want to shout it out to the world. Using positioning in that sense. not as an artificial thing, but as a stand-in word for something that we actually have to do, and we do every day.
In Iskcon, now we are taking up the Gurukula projects also. Like we have in Vrindavan, we have traditional kind of Gurukul, that is our Mayapur Gurukul, but some of the schools, like they are said to be Gurukuls, but they're modern education schools. They are affiliated to either CBSE or ICSE. Like Vrindavan is affiliated to ICSE. Now because I have studied in CBSE, I'm not too much familiar with the ICSE board curriculum. But still, when we teach science according to the syllabus ICSE or CBSE, then it is according to the what they are teaching, like maybe Darwin or current positioning of science in terms of our planetary systems and how the universe works. And on the other hand, we are through Srila Prabhupada books teaching something else. So how do we reconcile or we are taking a dangerous position in terms of that way of teaching?
When you put a question in those terms, that you have an educational institution that is licensed by the government, through the education ministries, or accredited or given its status through some government organization, and you're mandated by the conditions, the regulations to deliver that in your curriculum, you have to follow that curriculum, then it becomes a question, to change that requires a whole new level of organization and intent. And that means understanding the curriculum formation procedure in the government entity in which you're dealing with. And I don't know all the details about how that's done in India, if it's strictly a matter of the central government or if it's decided on the state level. But, there's some process whereby they adopt, their curriculum. So if we want to become involved in that as a society to try to change and modify the nature of the curriculum, that's another whole level. How we as a society deal with the fact that, well, that's the way it is, we have to teach these things. We could take it as in this way that, if we're going to have some relationship between our practice of Krishna consciousness and the practice of modern science, and even if we're going to adopt a critical attitude, then we should know what they're actually saying, what it is we actually want to criticize, so that we're not, if we are adopting a critical attitude, we're not dealing with what's called straw persons. In other words, positions that they really aren't taking. So we could look at it like that. I'm just saying these things and trying to make the best of a bad bargain. I mean, the ideal thing, we would be in a Vedic Varnashram culture where in the government schools, under the authority of the Rajarshis, you'd be presenting the parampara teachings of the Vedic culture, Vedic civilization, as handed down through the chain of disciplic succession. Okay, we're not in that position, so in the spirit of making the best use of the bad bargain, well then, maybe there has to be 2 tracks of education on these topics. That would be my personal way of responding. But I think the question you raised is a real one. You're obviously dealing with it on some level, and maybe some further guidance from the society as a whole through its education ministry or whatever is necessary. Maybe policies need to be developed in that area. I understand the education ministry over the next few days is going to be having what's Viplava conference. So I would suppose these are the kinds of issues that come up. Okay, anything else?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Prabhuji, if you compare both the science, like Vedic science and material science, those are reading in school and colleges. Sometimes in Vedic science, first we keep the faith, then result come. And you go to the school and colleges, they first research something, then believing. In that condition, the material science is believing more in science. The science student, they are believing on material science. They are not believing in Vedic science. So how you can do for that? What are the steps we take for that?
Yeah, this is the feedback I've been getting from the different groups here at the ILS that I've presented this seminar to have been very valuable for me. I first tested this presentation at the devotee college, the Bhaktivedanta College in Budapest, Hungary last year. I tried it out on one group of devotees, and then based on their feedback, I brought it here, and I presented it 4 times. So what I've kind of learned from some of the questions is that I may need to add another set of positioning questions, and that is, how does a practitioner of Krishna consciousness interested in science position oneself in relation to the different kinds of, you could say, modern mainstream secular science and alternatives to it, like intelligent design, Christian creationism, Vedic science, and so on. So that's a very valuable part of the feedback that I've gotten from you collectively in the course of giving this seminar 4 times at the ILS. So each individual, I think, is going to approach this question in a different way. Some are going to say there's just one science, and sometimes Srila Prabhupada would define, science in that way. It's something it's proved by experiment, and you get the result. You propose the experiment, you get the result, that's science. So, and they say there's just one science, like that. But others may take the point that, yes, there are Vedic sciences. If you look at the Vedic literature, there were the Shruti and the Smriti, and then there's the Vedanga, Jyotish, Vedic science, you could say. And, some would like to see those things introduced into the curriculum, and then others say no. But that in Vedic civilization, as described in the Shastras, these quote, Vedic sciences were there. So, how to position oneself on the question of whether the Vedic sciences should be introduced into the curriculum. I think that was your question, right? Am I stating your question properly? You want to clarify again your question?
Suppose you take any principle, like in Vedic science, you take the principle, so like a creation. Suppose you take the chapter creation, then how you can define for that?
Okay, the question is taking an idea from the Vedic literature, which we could call Vedic science, like creation, how can one introduce that into scientific discussion? Again, there might not be just one answer to this question, but I'll answer it according to my personal experience. I've taken an idea from the Vedic literature, namely the idea that humans have existed for millions of years on Earth. You go all over India. There are, like even around Mayapur, there are temples where there are deities. They say this is from Satya Yuga. Satya Yuga is 4 million years ago. You go to Vrindavan, there's Dhruva God. Dhruva lived at the beginning of the Manvantar, 100 million years ago. Ram lived during Treta Yuga, over 1 million years ago. So what I've decided to do in terms of my positioning, is to go to the scientific world, the archaeologists principally, and say, I can't give them a statement from Shastra as evidence. To you, I could give a statement from Shastra as evidence for human antiquity. But they want some pratyaksha and anumana. So I make it into a hypothesis that they can understand. If what the Vedic literature says about human antiquity is true, then we should expect to find reports of archaeological evidence showing that humans existed millions of years ago. All right, then we test that hypothesis. We start looking at all of the archaeological reports in all the different languages from, let's say, the time of Darwin to the present. And then when we do that, we find hundreds of reports of archaeologists finding human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, millions of years old. So then I would say, oh, well, isn't that interesting? Here's some evidence that's consistent with the Vedic worldview. So that's personally how I approach these things. But I understand that others may approach these things in a different way that's equally faithful to Scripture and Srila Prabhupada, but maybe a little different than the way I do it. Okay, so we kind of started almost on time. We're going to end almost on time. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Before you all go, I don't know why, but there was no one that introduced him. I was here. Did anybody introduce him? So obviously, you know this is Drutakarma prabhu, but you should all know Drutakarma, if you don't, was a major pioneer in standing up against the materialistic scientific paradigm, most notably with his book Forbidden Archaeology, and then the condensed version Hidden History of the Human Race, and other books that follow from that. He's traveled around the world. He's spoken at some of the most prestigious scientific and social environments, on radio, on television. He's traveled to countries all around the world, and he's really had a major effect in drawing intelligent people to question the paradigms that they bought into. So those of you that don't know, he's a hero, a really phenomenal hero. The history of the human race that they tell, I'm going to get a little poetic here. The history of the human race that they tell will someday go away because it's wrong. I think the history of what he's done will last a lot longer. So let's give him another round of applause.